This is the BBC World Service, and on our website you can explore more of our programmes, from documentaries to science. Listen and download at any time by going to bbcworldservice.com. On air, online and on smartphones, this is the BBC World Service, the world's radio station.
Welcome to Newshour from the BBC World Service. I'm Julian Marshall. Ukraine is now calling conditions for civilians in the besieged city of Mariupol critical.
There is actually no condition for living there, staying there. It's like 7 days when people staying there underground without food, without supplies, without electricity and heat.
Russia has been ridiculed at the UN Security Council for claiming that Ukraine is trying to develop biological weapons with the help of the United States. We're on the front line talking to Ukrainian soldiers in the country's second city, Kharkiv.
We have a lot of people from other states, but we fight in our land and we protect our families. It doesn't matter how they fight. We fight like lions and they won't win.
And as Russia expands its offensive, we'll hear from the city of Lviv, which over the centuries has sat on the borders of empires to the east and west. That's after the news.
BBC News, I'm John Shea. The G7 group of leading industrial nations and the European Union are imposing further restrictions on trade with Russia in response to the invasion of Ukraine. The latest measures will allow them to ban or impose punitive tariffs on Russian exports. Announcing US backing for the plan, President Biden said Vladimir Putin must pay the price for aggression. Our business correspondent, Theo Leggett, considers the implications of these steps.
They are a big deal, particularly when you consider that they come on top of some of the most far-reaching financial sanctions groups of nations have ever put together. The G7 nations have agreed to revoke Russia's most favoured trading nation status, which is the status conferred on WTO members to make sure they're not discriminated against. Well, this opens the way for the G7 nations to impose punitive tariffs on any products coming out of Russia. Russia will be denied the ability to borrow money from international organisations like the IMF and the World Bank on the principle that Russia cannot violate international law and expect to benefit from being part of the international economic order.
The UN disarmament chief has dismissed allegations by Russia at the Security Council that Ukraine is trying to develop a biological weapon with the help of the United States. But numerous other Security Council members accused Moscow of using the body to spread disinformation, several raising concerns that Russia might itself be preparing to use chemical weapons in Ukraine. Kiev's ambassador to the UN is Serhiy Kislitsya.
So what else are you going to use against Ukraine? Cruise missiles, multiple rocket launchers, heavy aerial bombs? We have already experienced all of this. What is next? Ammonia? Phosphorus? And what will be the next target? One more residential building? One more maternity hospital? One more school?
The authorities in the besieged southern Ukrainian port of Mariupol say more than 1,500 civilians have been killed in the 12 days of the Russian blockade. Officials at Ukraine's Interior Ministry have described the situation there as critical, accusing Russia of blocking attempts to deliver humanitarian aid. Lise Doucette is in Kiev.
The priority for Russian forces, even as they regroup, it seems, around the capital Kiev, is they're pounding cities, particularly to the south, including, of course, Mariupol, which seems to be the most grave humanitarian situation. And there was a report earlier in the day that the last communications tower had been hit and cutting people off. And you hear from so many people here in Kiev and elsewhere who are desperate to find out what is happening to their relatives in the city. Are they safe? And of course, amid those reports of more than 1,200 bodies lining the streets, people fear the worst.
World News from the BBC. The former student protest leader Gabriel Boric has been sworn in as the youngest ever president of Chile. Mr. Boric, who's 36, has promised to overhaul Chile's market-led economic model, which dates back to the time of the former military ruler Augusto Pinochet. The Saudi Arabian blogger Raif Badawi has been freed from prison after serving a 10-year sentence on charges of insulting Islam. Lipika Pelham reports.
Raif Badawi's wife, Ensaf Haidar, tweeted, "After 10 years of detention, Raif is free." Ms. Haidar lives in Canada with the couple's 3 children and has led an international campaign for her husband's freedom. Mr. Badawi was sentenced in 2012 to 10 years in prison, 1,000 lashes and a fine of about $340,000 for criticizing the country's clerics in his writings. His case attracted worldwide attention. Ms. Haidar has recently said Saudi Arabia's rulers are working toward more openness, a reference to the so-called Vision 2030, a set of social reforms proposed by the Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman.
Human rights groups say Egypt has this week executed 7 people convicted of carrying out Islamist attacks. They were all convicted of taking part in attacks on police. Security sources in Burkina Faso say at least 10 people have been killed by suspected Islamist militants. They said the insurgents attacked an illegal gold mine near the border with Niger. Several Islamist groups operate in the border areas between Mali, Niger and Burkina Faso. The German Foreign Minister, Annalena Baerbock, has expressed Germany's desire for Serbia to become a fully-fledged member of the European Union. She was speaking during a visit to Belgrade at a joint youth conference with the Serbian President, Alexander Vučić. She gave no timescale. And that's the latest BBC World News.
Hello and welcome to Newshour from the BBC World Service, coming to you live from our studios in central London. I'm Julian Marshall. The southern Ukrainian port city of Mariupol has become emblematic of the suffering inflicted on civilians by Russia's invasion. It's not the only town or city to have been bombarded by the Russians over the past 2 weeks in a tactic designed to intimidate civilians and force them to leave. But 12 days of Russian bombardment have brought the residents of Mariupol to their knees, cowering underground shelters without food, water, medicine and heat, in temperatures way below freezing. It's a city under siege and no targets have been off limits. A hospital was hit on Wednesday and civilians risked death if they emerged from their shelters and tried to make their way out of Mariupol. More than 1,500 people are reported to have been killed since the Russian attacks began. Ukraine's Interior Ministry is now calling conditions in the encircled city critical and has doubts whether a convoy of humanitarian aid will reach its destination. Maria Kopian is the Deputy Interior Minister.
Mariupol fell into the trap of humanitarian catastrophe. All attempts to deliver food and medicine to our citizens are blocked by the Russian army. We couldn't have a connection with anyone in the city, including our forces, because there is no chance to reach out by phone or somehow anyone. We were trying to organize and form columns with white flags. As soon as such an intention is manifested on the Ukrainian part, the Russian army opened demonstrative fire from machine guns and mortars on the movement of such columns, forcing people to return to the city.
What about conditions in the city?
There is actually no condition for living there, staying there, without food, without supplies, without electricity and heat. You know that right now in Ukraine it's like -3.
And you were saying you've been trying to get an aid convoy into Mariupol. How close has that got?
It's impossible to do because if you are organizing and moving like 1 kilometer and they see the moving inside the city, so the shooting will start, and it makes for us very hard to reach and to get any chance to go out from the city.
So are there any further plans to evacuate civilians from Mariupol?
Yes, we're trying to find any gaps or any windows when the shooting is stopped, and organize like not huge convoys but very small number of cars to the different parts of the city. And at the same time we are talking with other partners who have citizens there. For example, there is currently 86 Turkish citizens are hiding in a mosque and 34 of them are children. And we were talked to Turkish side to negotiate with Russia somehow to support to idea to get an access to the city. The same we had a negotiation with the Italians, with the Greeks, because they also have citizens in Mariupol right now.
Why do you think the Russians have targeted Mariupol in this way? I mean, they've been bombarding cities across Ukraine, but Mariupol seems to have suffered the most. Why is that, do you think?
I believe that this is revenge from the persistence of the people of Mariupol, who have been expressing their pro-Ukrainian position since 2014. And since now, they are still pro-Ukrainian, even under these huge attacks in last 1 week. So that's why I think this is symbol for Russian government to believe and to capture the whole city, to show the success story here.
So you think that if they crush the will of the people in Mariupol, it will send a message to other cities and towns?
For sure. Exactly. So they want to demonstrate that they have a power, and if the Mariupol case will be successful, they will demonstrate to other surrounding small cities or big towns that this is your future if you will not give up and if you will not support the idea of pro-Russian occupation.
That is Maria Kopian, Ukraine's Deputy Interior Minister. Well, some 500 kilometers to the west of Mariupol lies the city of Mykolaiv on Ukraine's Black Sea coast. It too has been under Russian bombardment, but Ukrainian troops there have successfully thwarted a major Russian advance west towards the larger port of Odessa. Our correspondent Andrew Harding has just arrived and has sent this report.
We just cleared the last checkpoint and are driving now into the big port of Mykolaiv. Heavy snowfall, and in the distance I've been hearing the dull thump of outgoing artillery. That is the front line now. The Russians have been trying to seize Mykolaiv for the last week or so. It's a crucial part of their plan to take the whole of the Black Sea coast, including the big city of Odessa. But for now, the local defenders are holding the Russians at bay.
We pulled them back from the borders of our city, about 15, 20 kilometers there.
This is Ukraine's regional governor, Vitaly Kim.
They are almost surrounded.
So from your perspective, you're winning this war.
We're winning this fight, but not this war.
I've come down to the local hospital. 250 casualties in the past week, 12 dead. The head doctor, Alexander Demianov, is here, very emotional, very frustrated. What would you say to the world?
To the world?
What is your message?
Close our sky. Close our sky. We cannot work under the bombs, under the rockets. It's a dangerous.
You want a no-fly zone enforced?
Yes, of course.
Well, as the air raids are not the first today, we've seen busloads of women and children fleeing further west, but Mykolaiv's defenders and an army of civilian volunteers are standing firm, hoping to continue blocking the Russian advance along the Black Sea coast.
Andrew Harding reporting there from Mykolaiv. Well, Russia has been widely ridiculed at the United Nations for repeating its unsubstantiated claim that Ukraine has been trying to develop biological weapons with the support of the United States. Well, the meeting was called by Russia, and its ambassador, Vasily Nebendia, said evidence had been found of a network of biological research centers in Ukraine, but members rejected his assertions as a lie and utter nonsense. The U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, Linda Greenfield-Thomas, said Washington was deeply concerned that Russia had called the session as a false flagger with the aim of using its own biological and chemical weapons in Ukraine.
Russia has a track record of falsely accusing other countries of the very violations that Russia itself is perpetrating.
And given that, and consistent with our previous statements, we have serious concerns that Russia may be planning to use chemical or biological agents against the Ukrainian people. The intent behind these lies seems clear, and it is deeply troubling.
Well, I'm joined now by Greg Koblenz, a member of the Scientists Working Group on Chemical and Biological Security at the Center for Arms Control and Non-Proliferation in Washington, D.C. And Mr. Koblenz, is there any evidence at all that Ukraine even has the means to develop a biological weapon?
There's no evidence whatsoever that Ukraine has or wants to develop biological weapons. The only country that is alleging that is Russia, which is in the midst of an invasion of that country. Ukraine's been a member of the 1972 Biological Weapons Convention, which banned these weapons since the beginning. And just today, the UN High Representative for Disarmament said that there's no evidence of any violations of that treaty in Ukraine.
But is Ukraine involved in any way in biological research or research into hazardous biological substances?
Ukraine has endemic diseases in that country that it needs to study for public health reasons. And so it has biological research institutes and public health labs that do that research for peaceful public health purposes and scientific purposes. And those are the kinds of labs that the United States has been supporting over the years with training, education, and equipment.
Do you think that the United States has been sufficiently clear about that in the past to avoid these Russian suspicions?
The U.S. has been completely open and transparent about what it's been doing in Ukraine since the early 2000s, and you can find detailed information on the website of the U.S. Embassy in Kiev and in Department of Defense reports going back many years. So the problem is not the lack of use transparency. The problem is Russian baseless allegations that serve only to create a smokescreen to prevent people from looking at the more important issues.
So Russia is repeating baseless allegations that it's made before. I mean, what was the response when it did that?
The Russians have a long history of making these kinds of allegations, and even going back to the Soviet times when the KGB started a rumor that the United States had created the HIV virus. So this is, again, just a latest example of the permanent disinformation strategy. And the only thing that's really different now is that they've managed to use the UN Security Council as a forum for airing their disinformation. But these are the same kind of lies, allegations that have been circulating for many years.
Okay, if we're to believe the United States that what Russia is doing is engaged in a false flag operation with the aim of deploying its own biological and chemical weapons in Ukraine, what does Russia have at its disposal?
So Russia, as we know, has Novichok nerve agents, which it used in the attempted assassination of Sergei Skripal in the United Kingdom several years ago, and again in the attempted murder of Alexei Navalny in 2020. So we know that Russia has this very deadly nerve agent, which is now banned under the Chemical Weapons Convention. And there's also a good amount of evidence that Russia has not only maintained but upgraded the secret military microbiology facilities that they inherited from the Soviet Union, that were part of the Soviet Union's biological weapons program. That these facilities are still in operation, they're still secret, and they've actually been upgraded over the years. So Russia has both chemical and biological weapon capabilities they could employ if they chose to do so.
Mr. Koblenz, many thanks. Greg Koblenz, a member of the Scientists Working Group on Chemical and Biological Security at the Center for Arms Control and Non-Proliferation in Washington, D.C. And still to come on Newshour, former Ukrainian President Viktor Yushchenko gives a chilling verdict on how he thinks the war in this country might end.
The war will end in two instances. Either they push the last Russian soldier from Ukraine,
And this is another option for finishes when the last Ukrainian hero dies.
And the latest headlines from the BBC Newsroom. The G7 group of leading industrialized countries and the European Union are to strip Russia of trade benefits to further isolate Moscow over its war in Ukraine. And UN's disarmament chief says she has no evidence to support a Russian allegation that Ukraine has conducted dangerous biological experiments. This is Julian Marshall with Newshour live from the BBC in London. Earlier in the week on Newshour we spoke several times to a young woman who was trying to escape the fighting in the city of Sumy in northeast Ukraine. On Wednesday she was in a car trying to leave with her friends, along with thousands of others queuing up until the road was deemed safe. Well, they got out and all headed to the city of Poltava, about 200 kilometers away. The BBC's Sarah Rainsford reports from there.
Daniel escaped, and this sweet-sounding poem is all about enemies and occupiers. We met in a small classroom at his home for now, and his young mum told me how they fled here for their lives. Their own town is Sumy, at the Russian border, and it's been bombed and shelled for more than a fortnight. So I asked Daniel whether he's been living in his basement. He tells me he had to run there every day, 3 or 4 times, his brother says. This week, Russia and Ukraine agreed a short ceasefire to evacuate civilians, and in Sumy, it's actually stuck. We tried to join the safe corridor, but didn't know the time. So we got put in the car with people going to Poltava. We just got in with strangers and left, just like that. My husband is still there. They don't let the men leave. Beside Alina and Danilo on another mattress, a much younger boy was flat on his back, enjoying the first undisturbed sleep in a city with no shooting and no fighter jets. This school, Disney number 3 in Poltava, now shelters up to 100 evacuees every night. We came because we are afraid for our lives, because of the planes flying over our heads. They're bombing us. We walked over broken glass. We saw the ruined buildings, the bombing, the roofs ripped off. It was scary. That's why we're fleeing, running as fast as possible from the shooting, trying to save our lives, and the children above all. There are no school dinners anymore, just giant stacks of food for families on flight, and for hundreds of Ukrainian soldiers. All the produce is donated, and teachers clear the vegetables, because normal classes, like normal life, have been suspended. Katya arrived a couple of days ago from Kharkiv, another northern city in the siege. The 15-year-old's whole life is now carried in one small bag. Then there's Richie, her ginger cat. There was no safe corridor in Kharkiv, so Katya and her dad decided to make a dash for safety one day at first light. 10 minutes into backing the car, there was more shelling, and they had to rush back to the basement. Katya's aunt, Svetlana, talks a lot about the Russian fighter jets, their terrible war that so scared her. She says they've all learned to dress in 30 seconds and to run like they've never run before. Her brother thinks the Russians are trying to make people panic, to scare them into submission. Most of their neighbours have left Kharkiv now because the bombing is hitting homes and killing civilians.
The city is being destroyed. All the infrastructure, the schools, clinics. It's civilians who are suffering. I don't know why they decided to destroy us. Because we resisted them? Because we are united?
This is all Russian-speaking Ukraine. The area Vladimir Putin claims he's liberating from oppression, but no one here asks to be saved.
Svetlana's family plan to stay put for now, not flee any further. She tells me leaving Ukraine would feel like surrender. And anyway, they've got nowhere to go. Poltava feels safe, but we've all known that can change in an instant.
Zara Rainsford reporting from the Ukrainian city of Poltava. Let's hear now from the former Ukrainian president, Viktor Yushchenko. You might remember him. He triumphed over his pro-Russian rival Viktor Yanukovych in 2004 amid the so-called Orange Revolution, when protests and civil disobedience succeeded in securing another vote after a disputed election had the pro-Russian winning. He's also remembered as the candidate who was poisoned. His face showed the effects. It seemed to have been a professional job, although he ultimately managed to recover. He lost power in 2010 and the pro-Russian Yanukovych won it, until the Maidan uprising toppled his government in 2014. The BBC's Evan Davis began by asking Viktor Yushchenko where he is now.
I'm in Ukraine. Around me, war is going on. Around me, there are many cities and towns which are not occupied, but surrounded by Moscow fascists. There are people starving in desperate need of humanitarian aid, but they are not receiving it. Or people who want to leave for safe areas. Perhaps that was the most dangerous night when Moscow fascists bombed several dozens of Ukrainian cities and towns. So these are classic fascists, which are doing ethnic cleansing or Nazi war.
Did you think President Putin, could you imagine he would ever do this?
Frankly speaking, no. I didn't think that he had so many hidden features of an animal or a beast. How did it happen? Putin is conducting a textbook war, and unfortunately we're only just beginning to assess things he's doing now. We have an extremely weak reaction to what Putin is doing. First of all, the reaction coming from the government. Frankly speaking, I see a big issue at the government level when many leaders are not in the far front of this war.
But do you understand, Mr. Yushchenko, why the West has not created a no-fly zone or sent fighter jets into Ukraine? It is the fear of this escalating into a true world war, into a conflict that is much, much more serious for the whole of Europe.
I will start from saying that 6 wars have been going on in Europe for the past 6 years. Nagorno-Karabakh, Abkhazia, Crimea, Transnistria, Donbass. Who are shouting from all possible platforms, why don't you read the situation the way it is? Don't you understand, on the basis of these 6 wars, there's only one problem, one issue. It is Russia.
You were president for those 5 years, 2005 to 2010. Do you have any regrets yourself now about what you did then? Do you look back and think somehow you should have changed the way Ukraine was settling its position between Russia and the European Union?
My regret is in terms of security. The statement I signed in spring of 2008 that was refuted by the Bucharest NATO summit. It was declined, and it's a shame. I feel ashamed for that, because after that, Putin entered Georgia, and 6 years after that, he entered Ukraine.
A lot of people are asking, how does this conflict end? And I'm interested in whether you can imagine Ukraine making any concessions in a negotiation to get Russian troops out.
The war will end into instances. Either we push the last Russian soldier from Ukraine, and this is another option. The war finishes when the last Ukrainian hero dies.
That's the former Ukrainian President Viktor Yushchenko. You're listening to the BBC World Service. I'm Julian Marshall, and this is Newshour.
This is the BBC World Service with psychiatrist Henrietta Bowden-Jones sharing the experiences of people who have left their homeland. My guest is novelist Dina Nayeri, who wrote about being an asylum seeker after escaping Iran. It was particularly painful for me to leave my father behind because he and I had been so close. Not having him there, it was like just not having my co-conspirator in life. You finally found exile in the US. And what were your first impressions of the people in particular? It didn't help that everything that they saw from Iraq was so ugly and frightful and gruesome. And so they associated me with that. That experience altered your sense of self? The stories that I write are displacement and outsiderness, but also welcome. Open doors are my particular joy, getting to walk through them, having someone open and welcome me. That is my identity. Emotional baggage at bbcworldservice.com.
Coming up on Newshour in the next 30 minutes, we're on the front line with Ukrainian soldiers fighting the Russians in the country's second city, Kharkiv. We hear from a resident of the western city of Lutsk, where an overnight attack by Russia hit the airfield. And as Ukraine says Kiev is at risk of being encircled by Russian tanks, we'll take a look at Moscow's current military strategy. That's after the news. BBC News, I'm John Shea. The G7 group of leading industrialized countries and the European Union are to strip Russia of trade benefits to isolate Moscow further over the war in Ukraine. The latest measures will allow bans or punitive tariffs to be imposed on Russian exports. President Biden said Vladimir Putin must pay the price for aggression. The UN disarmament chief has dismissed allegations by Russia that Ukraine is trying to develop a biological weapon with the help of the United States. Izumi Nakamitsu told the Security Council there was no evidence of such activity. Russia's envoy told the gathering there was a network of biological research centers in Ukraine. Ukrainian officials say more than 1,500 civilians have been killed in the besieged city of Mariupol since Russian forces began their bombardment. The spokesman of the city for the International Red Cross has described appalling conditions there. Russia has announced a ban on Instagram after a change of rules by its parent company Meta to allow violent speech in relation to the invasion of Ukraine. The media regulator said the ban would take effect on Monday. Meta said it wanted to protect expressions of self-defense. In other news, the blogger Raif Badawi has been released from prison in Saudi Arabia after completing a 10-year sentence for insulting Islam. His case attracted worldwide attention and he was subjected to 50 lashes in public as part of his punishment. A mass burial has been held for the victims of a huge explosion in southern Ghana. 13 people died and an entire village was flattened by the blast in January. Hundreds of homeless people are living in temporary shelters. And a former student leader, Gabriel Boric, has been sworn in as president of Chile. Aged 36, he's the country's youngest ever head of state. He's promised to overhaul Chile's market-led economic model. A new constitution is being drafted to replace one dating back to military rule. BBC News.